Alrighty, so I'm here with Dr. Jonathan White talking about his new book, Day in the Life of Abraham Lincoln.
My Day with Abe Lincoln.
Brilliant, yes, My Day with Abe Lincoln. And so, what prompted you to write My Day with Abe Lincoln?
Well, I've done a lot of books for adults about Lincoln and other Civil War topics, but I have two little girls. The one just turned 8, Clara just turned 8 last week, and Charlotte is about to turn 11. So I've been telling them lots of stories about Lincoln. I've taken them to Lincoln sites all over the country. They've been to Springfield and Chicago and all over the place. And I wanted to try to find a way to tell a story that would be of interest to kids like them and their friends. And so I didn't want to write just a traditional history book of here's a biography of Abraham Lincoln or here's what it was like for Lincoln to go to school. I wanted to find a different way to do that. And so the way I came up with it was to do time travel and to have a little girl travel back in time and meet Lincoln. And throughout the day, everything she learns about him is true. So I give them their vegetables while they think they're getting ice cream.
Hmm. And when they meet Lincoln, how old is he?
So it's set in the early 1820s, and he was probably about 14 at the time. I don't make it explicitly clear, but he goes to school in Indiana, Andrew Crawford School. He was about 14 at that point in his life, and so that's about what he is in the book.
Okay, and uh, is it kind of a compilation of both your daughters, or is one more heavily promoted, or did you just kind of just make it more generic so they can't read into it like, hey, that's me or that's me? Because you know how I
Yeah, they
knowing
know.
the kids that they'll fight.
Yeah, they know who it's based off of, but I'd probably get in trouble for saying that on a recorded event. But I will point out they do both make cameos in the book. So at the beginning of the book, there's a note from Charlotte and Clara, and that's Charlotte's the older one, Clara's
Hmm.
the younger one. And then at the end of the book, the main character, her name is Lucy, she comes back to the present, and my girls are in the top corner there, just beneath the star.
Oh,
So
there we go.
both of them did, and all of the kids in that last school picture are friends of theirs. So I
Oh,
did
very
work them
nice.
into the book as little cameos.
There we go. And I bet they were excited to see themselves in a book.
They were, yes, they've been very excited. We did an event here in Newport News this past Saturday, and afterwards they signed books. And then we're doing another event at an indie bookstore this coming Saturday, and they'll be there to sign books there as well.
Was it kind of difficult in the writing process to like write for a younger audience, knowing that one of your last books just won the Gilder Lehrman Prize? It's more geared toward adults and maybe even more scholarship type writing, as opposed to writing for a younger audience that really doesn't have that scholarship behind them.
In a lot of ways, it was actually easier because there's less pressure to in the process of writing. Because if you're writing a historical nonfiction book, you have to double check everything, make sure your quotes are right, make sure everything is as accurate as possible. And every book has mistakes in it. I mean, I've looked back at my books and I found things that I got wrong, and I just think, oh, and the worst is when you publish a book and before it even goes to print, you realize there's a mistake in it, but at that point, it's too late to fix. So I've had that happen. Whereas with this book, I could be creative and I
Hmm.
could have fun with it and I could develop the story as I wanted to. And I've been doing a lot of storytelling for my kids, so bedtime reading to them or making up stories. And so I was able to just sort of take from those skills I've been working on for 10 and a half years and then apply it to making this creative story about Lincoln. But
Oh.
that said, what I tell people, so what I tell people is the book itself is about this third grade girl who travels back in time and meets Lincoln and his sister Sarah. And I tell people that the book is 100% historically accurate except for the time travel part. Just about everything that this character Lucy learns as she goes through her day with Abraham Lincoln are things that really happened to Lincoln or that
Hmm.
came out of the historical record. And so I did want it to be accurate in that sense, but I didn't have to stress quite as much about making sure that the quotes were 100% verbatim. Some of
Hmm.
the quotes in the book are 100% accurate to the historical record. Some of them I reshaped slightly just to make it more readable for a
Hmm.
6 to 9 year old audience. But then I also created a teacher guide that is for freely available on the press's website, Reedy Press.
Fantastic.
And that gives teachers and parents the backstory behind each of the stories and each of the quotes in the book, so that if people want to see what is this based on or how accurate is this, they can get that information there.
Oh, fantastic. I involved with NCHE, the National Council for History Teachers. So,
Yeah,
obviously anything you can help with teachers and parents is obviously fantastic, and always welcome free resources to,
right. Well, I wanted it to be so that if teachers use this in the classroom, they can make themselves the expert. So they
Mhm.
can read the teacher guide and then use the book in class. And then when kids raise their hand and say, did that really happen? Or what's the story there? If the teacher has looked at the curriculum guide in advance, they'll be able to say, well, yeah, this is what happened. And the other thing I did in the teacher guide was I put about a half dozen primary sources into it so that people can use them in the classroom. So, for instance, in the book, Lucy learns how Lincoln enjoyed reading about George Washington as a
Mhm.
child. And in the book, I have quotes from two of Lincoln's speeches from 1861, where he talks about reading about George Washington and the American Revolution as a child. And so teachers, I know, are always looking for primary sources, and I wanted to make those available that way.
Have you had a lot of feedback from teachers and parents using that in their classroom, or to using that and the primary sources?
The book is still too new to have really been adopted into classrooms. I went to a local school and met with the sixth grade here in Newport News about 2 weeks ago. And the teacher had bought copies of the book for her classroom, but she hadn't had any of the students read it yet. So I'll have to circle back to you on
Mhm.
that. And I talked to a charter school system in another part of the country that is considering using it. And so my hope is that when they look at the book and they look at the teacher guide, they'll see that there's something of use there. And one of the things that's interesting, a lot of schools or a lot of state boards of education for third or fourth grade require kids to read historical fiction
Mhm.
and then try to figure out how do you discern the difference between the fact and the fiction in the historical story. And so my book, I think, will really lend itself towards those educational standards that a handful of states have.
Fantastic. That I know when a lot of people think children's book, they often think of like the board books or the younger kids'
Mhm.
books that have like 4 sentences to a page and a lot of pictures. But this one is really more text heavy for those older students with a higher reading level that are reading more chapter books, correct?
Yeah, it's an early reader chapter book. It's got about 7,000 or 7,200 words. So I tell people it's the same length as the US Constitution. It's
Hmm.
right in that length. So it's not too long, but it's not too short. It has about 50 or 60 images. They're scattered throughout. And I've had 9 and 10 year olds read it. Actually, one of the things that's been most gratifying is that on Amazon, it's gotten all 5-star reviews so far. And I'd say about a third of the reviews, the parents quote just let their kids write the review and then put the age of the
Nice.
kid. So you have a 9-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 6-year-old saying, "Here's what I liked about the book," and that's been really fun to read.
Hmm. I I'm excited because I have two 10-year-olds and an 8-year-old that are right in that age range. And obviously being here in Springfield, I've dragged them to the museum, and I've dragged them,
Hmm.
to the home and the tomb. And, we're surrounded by Lincoln here, and they're kind of like, oh, it's Lincoln, but trying to get them excited about, it's not just local history, or, it's not just Springfield history, but trying to get them to see the Emancipation Proclamation or the
Hmm.
Gettysburg Address, and trying to get them excited about what that actually means and the weight of that on a historical and national level has been kind of a struggle, because
Yeah.
they're at that age where, they're boys and they want to play Nintendo and they want to play video games and Minecraft and stuff. So, um, what are your recommendations for getting kids that age involved and excited about your book?
Well, I actually wrote the book in the way I did, thinking about kids the way you just described yours, because I experienced that too with my kids. And I think every parent, or just about every parent, has experienced it to some extent or another. It's really hard to get kids interested in history. And I think so. I wrote the book in a way that it brings adventure through time travel in. And my hope is that, kids who enjoy reading fantasy or time travel, those sort of things, they'll find it interesting. They'll also see sort of the clashing of two worlds where this
Mm-hmm.
girl from the 21st century is going back to the 19th century. And so the expectations are different. And I think I tried to incorporate a little bit of humor in there. So when, the main character, when she thinks about tablets,
Mm-hmm.
she's thinking about these devices we have like iPads.
Mm-hmm.
And when she goes back into the 1820s in Indiana and talks about tablets, Abe and Sarah are thinking about these little slates that they write
Mm-hmm.
on with chalk. And so there's a disconnect there. And hopefully that will open up the imaginations of kids a little bit. The other thing that got me interested in history that I think can still work for a lot of kids is getting them to see the stuff of history and touch things from history. So
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in a farmhouse from the 1720s outside of Philadelphia. And when I was a kid, I found the trash pit out back, and I would dig up old belt buckles and bottles and all sorts of things, many of which I still have sitting in boxes in my garage, much to my wife's chagrin. But finding those things is one of the things that really gave me an appreciation and love of history. And then the other thing was just good stories. I
Mm-hmm.
remember my grandfather telling me family history stories or stories about the Civil War, stories about his childhood in the early 20th century, and those things really captured my imagination. And I think if we can find ways to give kids good stories, they will develop, or a lot of them will develop that interest. So that's what I tried to do in my day with Abe Lincoln, is give them a good story that will hopefully make them want to get the next book to read and learn something else.
Do do you think that Abe Lincoln will resonate with children, even even here in Springfield, even here in Illinois, that there's something still about him that can connect with kids, even though there's, like I said, surrounded everywhere with Abe Lincoln, that there's still something about him that still resonates with children?
I hope so. And what I try to do in this book is make him relatable.
Mm-hmm.
So I talk about some of the things that he struggled with. Every Friday, my daughters have spelling tests,
Mm-hmm.
and most kids in school have spelling tests on a weekly or somewhat regular basis. And so one of the big themes in the book has to do with the fact that Lincoln struggled with spelling throughout his whole life. As a kid, he misspelled words. As an adult, he misspelled a lot of words. And so, most Americans aren't going to know that. If you go into the collected works of Abraham Lincoln, you'll find that he misspelled the word very at least 38 times as an adult.
Mm-hmm.
When Lincoln was writing his inaugural address, he misspelled the word inaugural or inauguration. When Lincoln was a candidate for president, he misspelled the word wizard. When Lincoln was president, he didn't know how to spell the word missile. And so these are all things that are documented in the record, in the historical record, that most people don't know. But I made those a big theme in the book because I wanted Lincoln to be relatable. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that makes the book and Lincoln as a person relatable in a way that when you go to the Lincoln Memorial and you look up at the giant statue, you may be in awe of it, but you don't relate to it in the same way. He doesn't seem like a person. Another big theme that others have touched on is that Lincoln really struggled in his life with his emotions because he faced a lot of hardship. He lost an infant brother when he was little. He lost his mother when he was 9. He lost an aunt and uncle when he was 9. He lost his sister when he was a teenager. He lost 2 kids. So he lost his sweetheart, Anne Rutledge.
Mm-hmm.
Lincoln lost all of these people, and he had to figure out ways to cope with those emotional hurts. And that's something that I think a lot of kids struggle with, is how do
Mm-hmm.
you cope with emotional hardship and trauma. And so again, I brought some of those aspects into this story to try to make it something that would be relatable to kids who are going through difficult things in their lives. And so my hope is that kids will read the book and realize, wow, Lincoln was a real person just like I am, and Lincoln struggled with things just like I do, and Lincoln, not everything was easy for him, just like not everything's easy for me. And hopefully if they see that side of Lincoln through the lens of this other little girl from today, they'll Lincoln will become more real to them. And I think then when you appreciate that aspect of his life or those aspects of his life, then when you think about Lincoln the president, Lincoln the great emancipator, Lincoln who did all these incredible things, it makes it all the more remarkable to think about where he came from and where he got.
Is it, I think it would be hard, like if I really did time travel as a child or even as an adult, to spend time with Lincoln. You know, one of those things that you naturally want to do is like, don't go to Ford's Theater, don't do this,
Mhm.
don't do that. You know, is it hard not to put those things in a time travel book where you're a modern day person knowing what you know about Lincoln and how things turned out?
So I've actually written book 2. And in book 1, Lucy is in 3rd grade. It's the fall. She travels back in time and meets Lincoln when he's a teenager, early teenager.
Hmm.
In book 2, it's spring break, so it's about 4 or 5, 6 months later, and her family says, we're going to Washington, D.C. for spring break. And she travels back in time and meets Lincoln at the White House in
Oh, wow.
1861.
Okay.
And she's going to spend the whole day playing with Willie and Tad. I wanted to figure out a day in the Civil War to send her back in time, and I didn't want it to be after Willie died in February of 1862. So I
Hmm.
picked a date in August of 61 where some interesting things happened, and she's going to play with Willie and Tad all day, but she also interacts with Lincoln. And so she actually does have to grapple with the very things you were asking about. So before she travels back in time, she and her dad walk by Ford's Theater, and she kind of reflects on what that meant. And then when she goes back in time, she wants to tell Lincoln what's going to happen to warn him, but she doesn't get the chance to do that. And she will have to think about those things, and the book is still a work in progress. My hope is it'll come out in about a year, but those issues will come up. But I wanted to give her the first book to be, and I think both books are fun. The first book, there's nothing too heavy in it, although she does
Hmm.
learn about Lincoln's mom dying. But in the second book, she's going to grapple with some heavier topics because it's going to be in the midst of the Civil War.
Hmm. I think that actually sounds really exciting to me, something to look forward to in the next year or so.
Yeah.
Do you have anything other coming out more on the adult side that us grown-ups can look forward to?
Yeah, I'm working on a book with my friend Tim Orr. It's a photographic history of New York City during the Civil War, and that should be out in the fall. And then I'm also editing the diaries of a soldier from Minnesota who fought in the Dakota War of 1862 and then became an officer in a black regiment in the Mississippi River Valley in 63 and 64. So that will be published by UVA Press sometime in 2025. So I've got a couple things in the works, but they're taking a little bit of time to wrap up. And Lincoln figures into the New York City book in a somewhat significant way because he stopped there in February of 1860 for the Cooper Union address,
Hmm.
and then in 1861 on his way to Washington, D.C., and then, of course, in 1865 after he was assassinated. So he shows up a couple times in that book.
Now, is the New York book just being Irish and knowing that this is St. Patrick's Day week, as we call it here?
Yeah.
uh, I'm assuming, and correct me if I'm wrong, but obviously the New York draft riots are, a big Irish turning point in New York. Is
Yeah,
that
there's a
gonna?
whole chapter on the draft riots. There's a chapter on military mobilization that has a lot of the ethnic regiments that were raised. There's a chapter on common soldiers that has those Irish and German soldiers as well. So yeah, it'll be with the History Press as part of their Images of America series. And
Mhm.
we've got 12 chapters, and we really tried to capture every aspect of Civil War life. So from Broadway shows to commerce and manufacturing to politics to street riots to elections. There's an entire chapter on the election of 1864, so that will tell a lot about the Lincoln story as well.
Mhm.
And then there's one of the chapters I'm most excited about is on the Great Metropolitan Fair
Mhm.
in the spring of 1864, which was a sanitary fair that raised a ton of money for soldiers and their families. And that one was very heavily captured in photographs and newspaper illustrations. So I think it really brings that moment to life as well.
Is that the one that they raised that uh Everett sold the copy of the Gettysburg Address at? Or was that after?
I think that might have been the Philadelphia Fair, but don't quote me on that. Or maybe Boston, but I don't think that one was the New York Fair. Although if it was, I'm gonna have to double check that and work it into
I just think it off the top of my head because that's the copy of the Gettysburg Address we have here in Springfield.
right.
Is the Everett copy that he used to raise money for the at a sanitary.
Yeah, I'll
And I
need to
remember
double
it was
check
at
which one that was.
a sanitary fair, and I'm thinking it was like New York or Boston or someplace.
It would have been one of the big ones.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll need to double check that. Thanks for bringing that to my attention.
I just, yeah, because we always pull that out in into November. So
Right, I've gotten to see it, which is pretty cool.
yeah. So, alrighty. Well, thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you so
Yeah.
much for having me.